What kind of man sets his own city on fire just to watch a king burn? The year is 1467. It is Christmas night. Snow blankets the town of Baja in northern Moldavia. Inside the wooden walls, 40,000 Hungarian soldiers sleep off looted wine. Their king, Matthias Corvinus, the most powerful monarch in Central Europe, rests easy. He commands the legendary Black Army. He has crushed rebellions across the Balkans. He expects surrender by morning. He will not get it. At midnight, the sky turns orange. Flames erupt from 3 directions at once. The wooden palisades collapse inward. Hungarian knights stumble from their tents, half-dressed, choking on smoke. They reach for swords they cannot find. They call for horses already screaming in burning stables. In the chaos, a man on horseback rides directly into the inferno. He is not fleeing. He is hunting. His archers spot the royal guard and loose a volley. 3 arrows find their mark. Matthias Corvinus, the Raven King, falls with iron in his back. His guards drag him through the snow, out through the one gap in the flames. It is not an escape route. It is a killing zone. But the darkness saves him, barely. By dawn, the King of Hungary is crawling through the Carpathian passes on a stretcher. Behind him, Baja smolders. Thousands of his knights lie dead in streets they never had time to defend. The man who burned them out is 24 years old. His name is Stephen. History will call him Stephen the Great, but the survivors of that Christmas massacre knew a different truth. They knew a man who understood that when you rule a small country surrounded by empires, you do not play by the rules. You rewrite them in fire. This is not a story about a saint. This is a story about survival. It is a story about a prince who fought 47 battles and lost only 2. A prince who built more churches than any ruler in Eastern European history. A prince who executed his own generals for incompetence and captured Polish nobles to plow fields like oxen. And it is the story of why the Ottoman Empire, the greatest military power on earth, feared this man more than they ever feared his famous cousin, Vlad Dracula. To understand why, we must go back. We must go back to a wedding feast that ended in blood. We must go back to 2 orphaned boys hiding in the mountains, planning revenge. The Principality of Moldavia in the 15th century was a sliver of land wedged between 3 empires. To the west lay the Kingdom of Hungary, hungry for Danubian ports. To the north sprawled the Kingdom of Poland, always watching for weakness. To the south, across the Danube, the Ottoman Empire devoured everything in its path. Moldavia was not large. Perhaps 300,000 people lived there. Most were peasants. They farmed barley and raised cattle on the rolling plains between the Carpathian Mountains and the Black Sea. Their rulers were princes called voivodes. These voivodes held power only as long as they kept the noble families happy. The nobles were called boyars. They owned the land. They commanded private armies. They made and unmade princes at will. Between 1432 and 1457, Moldavia burned through a dozen rulers. Brothers murdered brothers, uncles moisened nephews. The throne was not inherited, it was seized. This was the world Stephen was born into. Historians estimate he entered it sometime between 1433 and 1440. His father was Bogdan II, a prince who had clawed his way to power with Hungarian help. His mother was Maria Oltea, likely related to the ruling family of Wallachia, the principality to the south. Stephen grew up in a court thick with whispers. He learned to read Latin and Church Slavonic. He learned to ride and fight. But most importantly, he learned to watch. He watched the boyar smile at his father while sending letters to his enemies. He watched foreign ambassadors promise help that never came. He learned that in Moldavian politics, trust was the first casualty. In October of 1451, the lesson became permanent. Stephen was a teenager. His father had called a wedding feast in the village of Reuseni. Wine flowed, music played. The guards lowered their spears. In the brutal calculus of the Balkans, this was a death sentence. The doors did not open for a late guest. They burst open for an assassin. Peter Aaron, Stephen's own uncle, stormed the hall with hired swords. He had not come to negotiate. He had come for the crown. Stephen watched his father cut down among overturned tables and spilled wine. Bogdan II was beheaded on the banquet floor. In the chaos, the young prince slipped into the night. He did not just lose a father that evening. He lost his country, his inheritance, and his innocence. He became a fugitive in his own land. Peter Aaron's men hunted him through the forests. They wanted to snuff out the last legitimate heir. Stephen fled south, crossing the mountains into Transylvania, then into Wallachia. And it was here, in the cold wilderness of exile, that destiny played its most ironic card. Stephen found refuge with another noble orphan, a young man who carried a similar burden of trauma and rage. His name was Vlad Dracula. History often paints them as rivals, but in those early years, they were blood brothers. Both were sons of murdered fathers. Both had seen their thrones stolen by usurpers backed by foreign powers. Both lived on borrowed time in the shadow of empires that wanted them dead. Vlad was older. He had spent years as a hostage in the Ottoman court. He had learned their language, their customs, and their cruelty. He was volatile. He was fire and terror. Stephen was different. He was ice. He was calculation. He was patience. While Vlad dreamed of impaling his enemies to create landscapes of fear, Stephen began to understand something deeper. Fear alone was not enough. You needed structure. You needed walls that could not be breached from inside. They spent years together, analyzing why their fathers had died. Bogdan had trusted family. He was murdered for it. Vlad's father had trusted the boyars. He was buried alive. The lesson etched itself into their minds. Trust no one. Strike first. Mercy is a luxury for the safe, and they were never safe. By 1457, the waiting was over. Vlad had reclaimed the throne of Wallachia and become the ruler history remembers as the Impaler. He did not forget his cousin. He gave Stephen 6,000 experienced Wallachian soldiers and pointed him north toward Moldavia. It was time to settle the debt. Stephen marched back into his homeland, not as a boy, as a warlord. He met his uncle, the usurper Peter Aaron, on the battlefield of Dolgesti on April 12th. This was not a skirmish. It was an execution. Stephen's forces shattered the usurper's army. Aaron fled to Poland, beginning a decade-long manhunt that Stephen would obsessively pursue. 2 days later, Stephen was anointed Prince of Moldavia. The ceremony took place in a field under open sky, surrounded by the soldiers who had bled for him. It was a coronation of iron, not gold. But as the crown touched his head, Stephen looked out at the faces of the Moldavian boyars, the nobility who had bowed to his father, then bowed to his uncle, now bowing to him. He saw the same men who had stood by and watched his father die at that wedding feast. He knew their loyalty was thin as morning mist. Stephen understood that defeating his uncle had been the easy part. The real war was just beginning. It was not against Hungary or the Ottomans, not yet. It was against the enemy within. The boyars believed they could control this young prince. They thought he was just another temporary ruler in the revolving door of Moldavian politics. They were wrong. They had crowned a man who had spent 6 years planning exactly how to dismantle their power, bone by bone. Stephen sat on the throne of Moldavia, but he knew he was sitting on a powder keg. In the 15th century, a prince was often just a temporary manager. He ruled only as long as he kept the powerful noble families happy. If he taxed them too much or limited their influence, he usually ended up poisoned, stabbed, or exiled. Stephen's father had been murdered precisely because he did not watch his back. Stephen had no intention of making the same mistake. His cousin Vlad had solved this problem in Wallachia with spectacular brutality. Vlad invited his treacherous nobles to a feast. He asked them how many princes they had survived. Then he impaled the lot of them while he finished his dinner. It was effective, but it was unstable. It created a climate of pure terror that eventually left Vlad isolated, with no one left to run the country. Stephen chose a different path, arguably more dangerous, infinitely more sustainable. He did not just want to kill traitors, he wanted to restructure society itself. He launched a systematic purge, but he did it with the cold precision of a surgeon rather than the rage of a butcher. He started by seizing the estates of any boyar who showed even a flicker of disloyalty. Executions were frequent, but they were always followed by a redistribution of assets. He took the land from the old entrenched families who felt entitled to rule, and he gave it to a new class of men. He called them the Vitegi, the braves. These were not high-born aristocrats. They were lesser nobles, free peasants, soldiers who had distinguished themselves in battle. Stephen offered them a simple deal: fight for me, bleed for me, and I will give you land, status, and a voice. For the first time, a Moldavian peasant had a direct line of loyalty to the prince. This bypassed the local lords entirely. This was revolution. In the feudal system of Europe, armies were usually collections of private levies raised by local barons. If a baron did not want to fight, his men did not show up. Stephen broke this dependency. By creating the Vitegi, he built a standing army that answered only to him. When he called the banners, 40,000 men would answer, not because their lord forced them, but because their prince had given them a stake in the country. To secure this new order, Stephen turned his attention to stone and mortar. He began a massive fortification project. Moldavia would become a porcupine of defenses. The crown jewel was the citadel of Suceava. He did not just repair the old walls. He engineered a fortress designed to withstand the new god of war, gunpowder artillery. He thickened the walls. He deepened the moats. He built sophisticated firing platforms. Suceava became the physical embodiment of his reign, unyielding, grim, permanent. He stockpiled it with grain, weapons, and gold. The message was clear, to both his internal enemies and his external neighbors. The days of weak, pliable Moldavian princes were over. But this consolidation of power came at a price. The old boyar family seethed in silence. They sent secret letters to Hungary, to Poland, even to the Ottomans, begging for someone to remove this tyrant. But Stephen was always one step ahead. He created an extensive spy network that permeated every court in the region. He knew who was whispering against him before they finished their sentence. By the early 1460s, Stephen had achieved what seemed impossible. He had pacified the internal chaos of his country. He had a loyal army, a full treasury, a secure throne. But stability in the Balkans is a fleeting luxury. Just as he finished securing his own house, the neighborhood began to burn. South of the border, in Wallachia, his cousin Vlad Dracula was picking a fight he could not win. Vlad had stopped paying tribute to the Ottoman Sultan. He had begun his famous campaign of terror against the Turks, impaling prisoners by the thousands, launching night raids into Ottoman camps, taunting the conqueror of Constantinople. The Ottoman response was inevitable and massive. Stephen watched the gathering storm with a calculating eye. He owed Vlad for the help in regaining his throne years ago. The code of honor dictated that he should ride south and stand shoulder to shoulder with his cousin against the Islamic invasion. But Stephen was not a knight in a romance novel. He was a practitioner of realpolitik. He looked at Vlad's reckless provocation of the Sultan. He looked at his own fragile, newly built state, and he made a decision that still divides historians today. The focal point of this drama was the fortress of Chilia, located at the mouth of the Danube River. Chilia was not just a castle, it was the economic lung of the entire region. Whoever controlled Chilia controlled the trade routes between the Black Sea and Central Europe. For years, Chilia had been garrisoned by Hungarians and Wallachians. Stephen knew that if he wanted Moldavia to survive, he needed that lung. He could not afford to let it fall into Ottoman hands. Nor could he leave it with a volatile cousin who was provoking a war he could not win. In June of 1462, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II led a massive army into Wallachia to crush Vlad once and for all. This was the moment for Christian unity. But while Vlad was launching his famous night attack to assassinate the Sultan, Stephen did something unthinkable. He marched his army to Chilea, not to help Vlad, to take the fortress from him. It was a cold, calculated move. While Vlad was fighting for his life in the south, Stephen was besieging his garrisons in the north. He was effectively opening a second front against his own ally. During the siege, Stephen was shot in the ankle, a wound that would never fully heal. It would plague him for the rest of his life, a constant physical reminder of his choice. But the surgeon knew what he was doing. He besieged the fortress for 8 days. He bombarded it until the Hungarian and Wallachian defenders surrendered. He seized Chilea. From a sentimental perspective, it was a stab in the back. From a strategic perspective, it was a masterstroke. By taking Chilea, Stephen secured Moldavia's economy and closed the Danube Delta to the Ottoman navy. He knew Vlad was doomed. Vlad's terror tactics had alienated his own nobles. He had no international support. Stephen calculated that it was better for Moldavia to hold the keys to the Danube than to let them sink with Vlad's ship. And sink it did. Shortly after, Vlad was forced to flee to Hungary. There he was imprisoned, not by the Turks, by King Matthias Corvinus, the same man Stephen would later humiliate at Baia. In Vlad's place, the Ottomans installed his younger brother Radu the Handsome. Radu was the anti-Vlad, soft, pliable, completely loyal to the Sultan. Wallachia had fallen. It was now essentially an Ottoman province. Stephen stood alone. The Bull of Moldavia was now the last independent power in the region. He had his fortress, he had his trade route, he had his army, but he had lost his buffer zone. There was no longer a wild dragon in the south to distract the Ottomans. The path to Moldavia was now wide open. Stephen spent the next decade preparing. He knew the bill for Chilea would eventually come due. He stopped paying the annual tribute to the Sultan, a direct challenge that echoed Vlad's earlier defiance. But, unlike Vlad, Stephen did not rely on spikes and terror. He relied on the Viteji, his peasant army, the network of fortresses he had painstakingly built. In 1473, the summons arrived. Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who had smashed the walls of Constantinople, the man who had turned the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. He was tired of this insolent Moldavian prince. He did not want tribute anymore. He wanted Moldavia. He sent an army of 120,000 men, arguably the most powerful military force on the planet at that time. They marched north toward the Danube. Against this tidal wave, Stephen could muster perhaps 40,000 men. The majority were not professional soldiers. They were the Rozia, free peasants armed with spears, axes, and bows. On paper, it was a suicide mission, 3-to-1 odds against the best-trained war machine on Earth. But Stephen knew something the Ottoman commander Suleiman Pasha did not know. He knew the calendar. The Ottomans invaded in late 1474. Winter was closing in. Stephen looked at the gray sky and the freezing mud and decided to weaponize the landscape itself. He issued a command that sent a shudder through his own people: leave nothing for the enemy. This was scorched earth taken to its absolute extreme. As the Ottoman column lumbered north, they found a ghost world. Villages were abandoned, granaries were empty, wells were filled with animal carcasses or poisoned. The Moldavians had taken their cattle and vanished into the deep forests and mountains. Imagine being an Ottoman soldier. You are marching hundreds of miles from home. The temperature is dropping below freezing. You are hungry, but there is no food to forage. You are thirsty, but the water kills you. And you are constantly watched. Stephen did not engage them in open battle. Not yet. He used hit-and-run tactics. His light cavalry burst out of the tree line, fired a volley of arrows into the Ottoman flanks, and disappeared before the heavy Sipahi could mount their horses. They targeted supply wagons. They picked off stragglers. They turned the march into a slow, bleeding ulcer. Suleiman Pasha pressed on, driven by arrogance and the Sultan's orders. He believed that if he could just force Stephen into a stand-up fight, superior numbers and firepower would win the day. He marched his starving, freezing army deeper into the trap, aiming for the capital Suceava. He did not realize that Stephen was hurting him. The Moldavian prince had chosen the battlefield weeks in advance. He had selected a narrow marshy valley near the town of Vaslui. It was a place where Ottoman numbers would count for nothing, where mud would swallow their cannons, where fog would blind their commanders. By January of 1475, the stage was set. On the morning of January 10th, the sun did not rise over the valley. It was choked out by a fog so thick that a man could not see the tip of his own spear. Suleiman Pasha was confident. Despite the hunger and the cold, he believed his sheer numbers would crush the Moldavian resistance. He ordered his troops forward across the high bridge. He funneled them into a narrow, marshy valley. He thought he was marching into a battlefield. He was marching into a kill box. The ground beneath the valley was a deceptive horror. The winter thaw had turned the marshland into soup, freezing mud. As the heavy Ottoman cavalry charged forward, their horses did not gallop. They sank. The pride of the Sultan's army was immobilized, flailing in the muck, unable to maneuver, unable to charge. Then the silence of the fog shattered. Stephen had positioned his artillery on the surrounding hills, 20 cannons. They fired blindly into the mist, but the target was so dense they could not miss. Cannonballs tore through the packed ranks of the Janissaries. But the cannon fire was just the opening note of Stephen's symphony. The real stroke of genius came from the forest. Stephen had ordered his musicians to hide in the dense woods far to the side of the main battlefield. Buglers, drummers, thousands of them. At his signal, they began to play. Bugles blasted the signal for a charge. Drums thundered through the trees. To the Ottoman commanders, disoriented by the fog and the chaos, it sounded like a massive fresh army was attacking their flank. Suleiman Pasha panicked. He ordered his troops to turn and face this invisible threat. But there was no army in the woods. There was a phantom. As the Ottoman lines twisted in confusion, exposing their backs to the valley, Stephen unleashed the real blow, his heavy infantry, his peasant soldiers who had been waiting silently in the mist. They charged. They did not fight with the elegance of fencers. They fought with the fury of men defending their homes. They wielded long axes and scythes, weapons designed to pull knights off horses and hack through armor. The result was a massacre. The Ottoman army dissolved into a panicked mob. They trampled each other in the mud, trying to escape. The bridge they had crossed became a bottleneck of death. Those who were not cut down by the Moldavians drowned in the freezing marshes. By the time the fog lifted, 40,000 Ottoman soldiers lay dead. 4 pashas were killed. Over 100 standards were captured. It was the greatest defeat the Ottoman Empire had ever suffered at the hands of a Christian leader. The Polish chronicler Jan Długos recorded that Stephen did not celebrate his victory. He fasted for 40 days on bread and water. He forbade anyone to attribute the victory to him, insisting that credit be given only to the Lord. But his letter to the Pope and the kings of Europe was not a victory lap. It was a desperate warning. "I have cut off the right hand of the pagans," he wrote, "but the other hand is coming." He knew Mehmed II. He knew the Sultan would not accept this humiliation. Vaslui was not the end. It was just the provocation for something much worse. Victory at Vaslui was a drug, and Europe was high on it. The Pope hailed Stephen as the athlete of Christ. Royal courts from Venice to Budapest sent letters of congratulation. But letters do not stop cannonballs. While the West celebrated, Mehmed II was gathering a storm that made the previous invasion look like a raiding party. In the summer of 1476, the Sultan did what he rarely deigned to do. He took personal command. He marched north with a massive army. But this time he brought an insurance policy. He coordinated with the Crimean Tatars to attack Moldavia from the east simultaneously. It was a strategic checkmate. Stephen was waiting in his prepared defenses. But when news arrived that the Tatars were burning villages in the east, his peasant army begged to go home, to save their families. Stephen understood that a soldier worrying about his burning home is useless. He let them go. He was left with barely 10,000 professional soldiers to face the full wrath of the Ottoman Empire. He chose his ground at Razboyeni, a plateau surrounded by dense forests. He could not win by force. So, he planned to turn the forest into a weapon. As the Ottoman vanguard approached, Stephen set the woods on fire. Imagine fighting in an oven. The Janissaries advanced through smoke and falling timber, choking, blinded, for hours. The small Moldavian force held the line, fighting like demons in the burning undergrowth. But the sheer weight of numbers was undeniable. Mehmed II, seeing his troops falter, threw his personal guard into the fray. The Ottoman wave broke over the Moldavian shield wall. Stephen's army was not just defeated, it was annihilated. The slaughter was so extensive that the battlefield was later named Valea Alba, the White Valley, because for years afterward, the ground was carpeted with the sun-bleached bones of the dead. Stephen escaped, but he was a broken man. His army was gone. His country was overrun. The Sultan was marching on his capital. This is the moment where most kings would surrender or flee into exile. And here we encounter one of the most powerful legends in Romanian history. The story goes that a wounded, exhausted Stephen rode to the citadel of Neamt, where his mother was staying. He knocked on the gate, desperate for refuge, desperate for comfort. The gate did not open. His mother appeared on the ramparts. She looked down at her son, the defeated king, the fugitive. And she refused to let him in. "I am the mother of a winner, not a coward," she is said to have cried. "Go back, gather what men you can, die for your country, or come back victorious. But do not come in here to hide." Whether she actually said those words is less important than what Stephen did next. He did not break. He turned his horse around. He rode into the mountains. He gathered the survivors. He rallied the peasants who had returned from fighting the Tatars. He turned into a ghost. Meanwhile, Mehmed was finding that conquering the land was different from conquering the people. He marched to the citadel of Suceava, expecting it to surrender. It fired cannons at him. He marched to Neamt. The gates remained shut. His army, vast and hungry, began to die. The scorched earth tactics were working again. Plague broke out in the Ottoman camp. Mehmed II, the man who toppled Constantinople, found himself standing in a deserted, burnt land, swatting at flies, watching his invincible army dissolve from disease and starvation. He had won the battle at the White Valley, but he was losing the war against the Moldavian spirit. In August of 1476, with his supply lines stretched to breaking and his men dying of dysentery, the Sultan ordered the retreat. He had burned the villages, but he had not broken the prince. Stephen emerged from the mountains, not as a conqueror, but as a survivor. He walked through the White Valley, looked at the bones of his friends, and swore an oath. He would rebuild. But as the Ottomans retreated, a new threat appeared. It did not come from the pagan south, it came from the Christian north. Poland, seeing Moldavia weak and bleeding, decided it was the perfect time to claim a piece of the pie. By the 1490s, Stephen was an old man by medieval standards. He had spent 40 years in the saddle. His hair was gray, his face was lined with the stress of survival, and the wound on his ankle from the siege of Chilea had turned into a festering chronic agony. He had earned a rest. He had earned the gratitude of Europe. Instead, he got an invasion force from his allies. In 1497, King John Albert of Poland gathered a massive army. Officially, he declared a crusade against the Ottomans to retake the lost ports of the Black Sea. Stephen, initially cautious, prepared to assist. But as the Polish army crossed the border, they did not march toward the Turks. They marched straight for Suceava, Stephen's capital. The mask had slipped. John Albert did not want to fight the Sultan. He wanted to depose Stephen and replace him with his own younger brother Sigismund. It was a naked power grab wrapped in the flag of a crusade. The shield of Christendom was being attacked from behind by the very people he was protecting. But John Albert made a fatal mistake. He assumed the old lion had lost his teeth. He laid siege to Suceava, pounding its walls for 3 weeks. But Stephen had spent decades turning that citadel into an impenetrable nut. The Polish cannons bounced off the reinforced walls. The Polish supply lines began to vanish, cut by Moldavian raiders. Realizing his crusade was turning into a disaster, John Albert negotiated a truce to retreat safely back to Poland. Stephen agreed, on one condition: the Polish army must return the way they came, through the devastated, mud-choked roads they had already ruined, not through the fresh, untouched lands of the north. John Albert agreed. Then he broke his word. He marched his army into the rich wooded territory of the Kosman forests. Stephen was waiting. On October 26, 1497, the Polish heavy cavalry entered the narrow ravines of the forest. The trees towered over them, creating a tunnel of gloom. Suddenly, the forest itself seemed to collapse. See! Stephen had ordered his men to cut the trunks of the massive beech trees almost all the way through, hiding the cuts with moss and leaves. As the Poles passed, the Moldavians pushed the trees over. Dominoes of timber crashed down onto the column, horses were crushed, knights were pinned. The formation was shattered before a single arrow was fired. Then the peasants attacked. It was not a battle, it was a riot. The heavy Polish armor, designed to deflect lances in an open field, was useless against trees and mud. The Moldavian peasants swarmed over the trapped knights, dragging them down, stripping them of their weapons. The aftermath contains a detail so specific and so humiliating that it reveals Stephen's utter contempt for the aristocracy that had betrayed him. He captured thousands of prisoners, including many high-ranking Polish nobles. He did not ransom them. He did not execute them. He put them to work. Stephen forced the proud Polish knights to break their swords and turn them into plowshares. He then yoked the noblemen to the plows, treating them like oxen, and he forced them to till the fields they had tried to conquer. He made them plant acorns. Imagine the scene: men who believed their blood was blue, who had never done a day of manual labor in their lives, whipped and driven across the mud by the very peasants they looked down upon. The beech forests of Bukovina that stand today are said to have grown from the acorns planted by the weeping nobility of Poland. This was Stephen's final lesson to the West. Titles meant nothing to him. Crowns meant nothing. If you came to his land as a conqueror, you would leave as a servant. He had defeated the Hungarians. He had defeated the Ottomans. He had defeated the Poles. He had secured his borders against every major power in Eastern Europe. But as the century turned and the year 1500 approached, Stephen faced an enemy he could not outmaneuver, could not ambush, could not bribe. His own body was failing. The infection in his leg was spreading, and the shadow of death was finally creeping over the Iron Prince. If you travel to the Bukovina region of Romania today, you will find something strange. Scattered among the green hills are churches painted on the outside with vibrant frescoes. These paintings have survived 5 centuries of snow, rain, and wind. The most famous is Voronet, known for a shade of blue so unique that art historians still call it Voronet blue. Its composition remains a mystery. But its purpose was clear. These were not just places of worship. They were books for the illiterate. They were spiritual fortresses, and they were paid for with blood. Tradition holds that Stephen made a pact with God. For every victory on the battlefield, he would build a monastery. By the end of his life, he had fought 47 battles and built 44 churches. It is a staggering ratio. No other monarch in European history has left such a dense physical legacy of their gratitude, or perhaps their guilt. Stephen understood that armies die, walls crumble, kingdoms fall, but culture, faith, that can survive occupation. By planting these fortified monasteries across the land, he was creating a backup drive for the Moldavian identity. He knew the Ottomans might eventually conquer the land, but he wanted to ensure they could never conquer the soul of the people. But while his stone legacy was standing strong, his physical body was rotting. The wound he received in his ankle during the siege of Chilia in 1462 had never healed for 40 years. It had been a dull ache. Now, in the early 1500s, it became a life-threatening crisis. The infection spread. Stephen, the man who could outride and outfight men half his age, was now confined to a litter or a carriage. He summoned the best doctors money could buy. Physicians arrived from Venice, from Genoa, from Nuremberg. Their methods were medieval torture disguised as medicine. Records suggest they tried to burn the infection out with red-hot irons. They cauterized the wound repeatedly, trying to stop the gangrene. Imagine the iron discipline required to rule a country while enduring that level of agony. He received ambassadors while his leg throbbed with fire. He dictated letters to the Pope while unable to stand. He planned the defense of his borders while bedridden. The pain must have been excruciating, a constant reminder of the violent path he had chosen. In these final years, the athlete of Christ began to prepare for the end. He retired more frequently to the Putna monastery, his first and greatest foundation. He was not hiding. He was assessing the future. He looked at the map of Europe and saw the reality his successors would face. Hungary was weakening, Poland was treacherous, the West was indifferent, and the Ottoman Empire was only getting stronger. The golden apple of Europe was ripening for the Sultan. Stephen realized that the era of total resistance was ending. He had held the gate closed for nearly half a century, buying Europe precious time, but he knew that after he was gone, the gate would burst open. His son Bogdan was a capable man, but he was not Stephen. No one was. So, on his deathbed, the old strategist made one final shocking calculation. He called his advisors and his son to his side. He did not tell them to fight to the last man. He did not tell them to die for glory. He gave them advice that seemed to contradict his entire life's work. He told them to surrender. On July 2nd, 1504, the bells of Putna Monastery began to toll. The sound rippled out across the valleys, carried from village to village until the entire Principality of Moldavia fell silent. The Iron Prince was dead. But before he took his last breath, Stephen left his son Bogdan III with instructions that stunned the court. He advised his son to make peace with the Sultan. He advised him to accept Ottoman suzerainty. To the casual observer, this looks like failure. It looks like the old man finally broke. But look closer. This was Stephen's final masterstroke. He realized that Moldavia was too small to fight the Ottoman Empire forever. The goal was never to destroy the empire. The goal was to survive it. Stephen had fought for 47 years not to prevent contact with the Ottomans, but to dictate the terms of that contact. Because of the terror he had inflicted on the Turkish armies at Vaslui, at Valea Alba, and in countless skirmishes, the sultans respected him. They feared him. So when Moldavia finally submitted, it did not do so as a conquered province. It did not become a pashalik directly ruled by a Turkish governor. It remained a sovereign principality. It kept its own laws, its own army, its own church, its own princes. The Ottomans were forbidden from building mosques on Moldavian soil. They were forbidden from owning land. All the Sultan got was a bag of gold once a year and a promise of loyalty. Stephen had bought his country's autonomy with the blood of his enemies. He ensured that while the map might be painted Ottoman green, the heart of the country remained Moldavian red. This unique status, autonomy within the empire, this is the reason why Romania exists today as a Latin island in a Slavic sea, and why its culture was never erased during centuries of domination. So, why does the world remember Vlad Dracula and not Stephen the Great? The answer lies in the nature of fame. Vlad is a global icon because he is a monster. He fits perfectly into our nightmares. A caricature of bloodlust that Bram Stoker could easily twist into a vampire. He is a great story because he is simple. Fear, blood, stakes. Stephen is harder to classify. He is not a monster. He is a monarch. He burned towns. Yes. He executed traitors. Yes. He betrayed his cousin. Yes. But he also built churches. He protected peasants. He negotiated treaties. He was a complex, contradictory human being who shouldered the weight of an entire civilization. He does not fit into a horror novel. He fits into the pantheon of the greatest statesmen in history. Vlad fought for revenge. Stephen fought for tomorrow. Today, if you visit the Putna Monastery, you can stand before his tomb. It is made of white marble, simple and elegant. There are no spikes, no grim legends of undead walkers. There is just an inscription. For the most glorious prince, history has a way of filtering out the noise. The Ottoman Empire has fallen. The Kingdom of Poland is gone. The Kingdom of Hungary was partitioned. But Moldavia, the core of modern Romania, survived. It survived because one man, 500 years ago, was willing to be the surgeon. He was willing to cut and burn and fight to keep the patient alive. Stephen the Great did not just hold the line, he drew it. And he drew it in iron so deep that not even 5 centuries of wind and war could wash it away. So the next time you hear the name Dracula, remember the cousin who stood in the shadows. Remember the man who did not just want to scare the darkness, but who built the light to hold it back. And every spring, the wildflowers return to Valea Alba,